But they kind of violated that. And where it came into play is when they dealt with the Jews. The problem is, kind of like politicians today, revenue. They always needed more money. These Caesars were definitely spenders. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some of these guys and some of the things they did, but they spent money like it was going out of style. Nero, we're going to talk about Nero, decided he was going to steal the treasures from the Temple of Solomon. Now, back in the day, in the Jewish faith, you made sacrifices. It meant you bought sheep, doves, other animals, which you gave a tribute to. And the priests, the Essenes as they were called in the Jewish faith, would cut or sacrifice the animals in exchange for not only the price of the animal, but a slight fee, service fee. And that money went into the temple. The temple was like a bank. A lot of wealth was sitting in the Temple of Solomon. Nero decided he needed it, looted the Temple of Solomon, and irritated his Jewish subjects, who rose up. And there was precedent for this, because the Jews had risen up prior to this. Judas Maccabee had risen up against the Seleucid Greeks, Antiochus, and thrown the Greeks out. In Palestine, prior to the Romans conquering it, they were a free society, free of occupation. However, this just caused a big problem when the Jews did it to the Romans, because this caused a 2-year war. The Romans eventually put down the Jews, and as part of the penalty, guess what? Tore down the Temple of Solomon. Today you go to Jerusalem, the only thing you see about the Temple of Solomon is one wall that remains. It's called the Wailing Wall or West Wall of the temple. Still a sacred place in Judaism. But for many people, the Romans didn't fool with your religion. If you were Greek and you believed in Zeus, they didn't mess with you. If you believed in the cult of Isis, they didn't fool with you if you were Egyptian. Or if you believed in the cult of Dionysius, they left you alone. As long as you paid your taxes, you respected Roman authority, and once in a while you made a sacrifice to the Roman gods, you're okay. That's the way it worked. Left you alone. Took care of you. However, people sought to escape from the day-to-day troubles of life through their local religions. Roman rulers were terrible people, very miserable people. And you got to remember that most people, unlike today, were confined to a territory about 60 miles around. Well, that would be like Muskegon County. I think, Muskegon may be part of Kent County or Oceana County or Ottawa County. 60 miles isn't far, but back in those days it was, because you went everywhere by what? Walking. Horses cost money. Most people don't have money for horses. Maybe they have money for a donkey, which they use to pull stuff. Horses were usually an item for pretty wealthy people, because you have to feed a horse. The lifespan or life expectancy of most people around this period averaged about 35 years. Wasn't really long. Although we've got a lot of people that did live much, much longer, and there's recorded records of them. Average person didn't make it. Life was tough. So people often had miserable experiences. Well, what changed? Well, we know there was the entry of a person called Jesus. Around 4 BC, person is born to a humble carpenter and his wife. And you kind of know the rest of the story. Hailed as the Son of God. His works were well documented in terms of, you're not going to get anything sitting out in the hallway. Please come in. Sitting in the hallway doesn't get you educated. So teaching, preaching, parables, miracles, all sorts of things were performed, and performed in front of people. We have records, written records of some of this. Now, unfortunately, Jesus met a violent end. He was persecuted, put to death. And this is where faith comes in. According to the stories, 3 days later, resurrected. And that resurrection and being hailed as the Son of God, part of a Trinity, is the basis of what we call today Christianity. But what are the major themes of Christianity that made it so appealing in a time when people were violent, were despotic, were miserable? Well, one, love one another. Well, that was almost, you would think, normal, but it wasn't. People were easily affronted. It was all about them. Adherence to the golden rule. Do unto others as you want done to you. God being omnipotent, being all-present, omnipresent, always there. Loving and just, as opposed to the Jewish God that's often retributive. In the Jewish faith, if you didn't make sacrifice and kept in the good side of God, what happened? Floods, plagues, lots of bad things. And the afterlife is a big thing. Because for many people, sweating in a field in the hot sun, being miserable, eking out an existence, that doesn't seem like a very productive, fruitful life. How many of you have often wondered, what is my purpose on this earth? I don't know. I always have that question. Maybe it's because I'm getting old. When I was 20, I had no questions. I had all answers. I had every answer. My students could tell me. They have all answers. And I tell them I have all questions. So it makes us a good pair. I can get their answers to my questions. And this idea of salvation, being able to reconcile for a life that extends beyond here, that won't be miserable. Those are central tenets. Now, think about these things. How does Christianity spread itself? If you're only confined to most of the works of Jesus being in an area about 60 miles around, how does the word go from a place like modern Israel, which is, out in the middle of the Middle East, to most of the world? And there's a recognition almost everywhere in the world of Christianity. Even if they don't believe it, they have heard of it, correct? So how did this happen? Well, there's no newspapers, there's no electronic media back then. There is none of the resources that you and I have. Today we're amazed. Something happens in the world, somewhere far away, tens of thousands of miles away, and within 5 minutes, most of the world what? Knows about it. Isn't that incredible? This period, that didn't happen. So how does things get about? How does the message have to travel? It's got to travel through communications, talk, people explaining things, word of mouth. Well, that's slow. The other thing is literacy is very low. Only about 3% of the people could read and write very well. And those people that read and wrote very well, They had good jobs. Oftentimes they were employed by kings or the government. Their jobs were called scribes. They did the bookkeeping. They did the writing. They did all of the things that were essential to keeping up. But most people don't have resources, don't know how to read. There is no paper like we know it. Product that's probably like papyrus or animal skins or some of the things along that way that people wrote on, parchment. And most people were uneducated, unlettered. In fact, most of the apostles of Jesus, the 12 that he had, would be considered to be, at that time, agrammatos. That means without schooling, no letters. They knew how to maybe write their name, count change. And that's a basic level, a very low level of literacy. Even if you meet people that are functionally illiterate today, they probably know how to write their name. They probably know how to count their change, count money, get by a little bit. But don't throw anything written in front of them because they're going to be lost, correct? So where does this information have to come from? Pictures. The old see it and I'll believe it. How important is that in life? You've probably said that to people. Show me. Prove it to me. Give me some information. The Byzantine church, or the church of the East, was very successful in doing this. Churches are laid out like storybooks. Everything is intentional. And we're going to learn a little bit about that tonight. And it's just not the representation of a religious figure or a saint that is important. But what is the symbols and what is about that story that is inspiring to the person?